All right, imagine this. 1862, middle of the Civil War, and the President of the United States
Mm-hmm.
is not sitting pretty
Mm.
in the White House. Instead, picture him out on the water,
Okay.
rowing a boat
Wow.
in the dark, right, in enemy territory.
No way.
Yeah, that's Abraham Lincoln we're talking about. And during 1 week in May, well, he was basically unstoppable.
It's an incredible story, and it really says a lot about how Lincoln led.
Mhm.
He wasn't the kind of guy to just sit back and give orders. He wanted to be right there in the action,
Mhm.
seeing everything firsthand so he could make decisions based on, well, what he saw himself.
We're going deep into a week that honestly changed everything for America.
Yeah.
We're basing this on
Yeah.
what you picked out from the History That Doesn't Suck podcast and a couple of other sources too.
Great choices.
So what are we trying to figure out with this deep dive?
I think the big question is how Lincoln's hands-on style compared to his generals who were a lot more cautious. Well, how did that actually affect the war?
Exactly. Yeah.
Especially someone like George McClellan, who was in charge of the Army in the Potomac.
Yeah, McClellan, he was a whole other
Oh,
story.
yeah.
But first, let's go to Fort Monroe in Virginia.
Okay.
Now, this was controlled by the Union, but it was under threat from the Confederate ironclad, the CSS Virginia,
Right.
or as most folks know it,
Yeah.
the Merrimack.
Yep.
And just for anyone who's not up on their ironclads, these were basically warships covered in thick iron plates,
Yeah.
making them really hard to sink with regular cannons.
That's right.
The Merrimack, well, it was a real game changer at the time. It had already caused a ton of damage to the Union Navy, and it being in the Chesapeake Bay,
Uh-huh.
well, that was a big problem for Lincoln and his whole administration.
For sure. It's a huge threat.
So Lincoln, along with his War Secretary, Edwin Stanton, and Treasury Secretary, Salmon Chase,
Mm-hmm.
they said, let's go see this for ourselves. So they sailed down to Fort Monroe
Wow.
to figure out how to take care of the Merrimack and get control of Norfolk,
Yeah.
which was this vital Confederate port.
A really important one.
Taking Norfolk was crucial for a few reasons. It would give the Union control of the James River,
Right.
a key supply line for the Confederacy.
For sure.
It would also be a huge win, symbolically,
Absolutely.
really hurting Confederate morale.
Definitely.
But some of the military advisors, the ones on the ground there, they weren't so sure.
I see.
They were worried about the Merrimack's firepower and also about these holes.
Shoals.
Yeah, basically shallow areas of water
Yeah, car.
that could stop Union ships from getting close enough to attack.
Oh, I see. Yeah, those shoals were a problem.
Yeah, so it makes sense why the advisors were being careful.
Right.
But Lincoln, he was a practical guy. He wasn't just going to take their word for it.
It makes sense.
He had to see for himself.
So that's what led to him, the president, rowing ashore in a small boat at night just to check out the landing site himself.
Can you imagine a modern president doing that?
I mean, the headlines would be wild.
Right.
It really shows how much he wanted to get things right, how determined he was. Yeah.
He wasn't afraid to get involved, put himself in a dangerous situation,
Yeah.
all to make sure the mission would work.
And turns out the landing site was fine. Those shoals, well, they weren't as bad as everyone thought.
Wow.
That kind of action, based on what he saw with his own eyes.
Yeah?
Well, it really makes Lincoln different from someone like McClellan.
Oh, yeah.
McClellan relied a lot on reports and seemed to always think the enemy was stronger than they were.
That's a good point. Lincoln wanted to see for himself, to challenge what people were saying.
Yeah.
That was a key part of how he led. It meant he could see through the confusion and make good choices, even when those choices went against what his military experts said.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to go against the grain.
Right.
And of course, we can't forget the big fight between the Merrimack and the Union's own ironclad, the USS Monitor.
Oh, yeah.
This was round 2 of a battle they had a few weeks before, which ended in a tie.
I remember reading about that.
This time, though, they fought near Fort Monroe.
Giving the Monitor backup from other Union warships?
I see.
The Merrimack, well, it didn't have a chance against so many.
Right.
So it had to retreat back up the James River.
Makes sense.
And with the Merrimack out of the picture, Union forces took Norfolk without much of a fight.
Wow.
It was a major strategic victory. And from what we read, it seems like Salmon Chase thought it wouldn't have happened without Lincoln being there himself.
Absolutely. Lincoln being at Fort Monroe, him questioning his advisors, and, well, that whole nighttime scouting mission.
Yeah.
They all set the stage for this win. It was crucial. Lincoln being at Fort Monroe, questioning his advisors, and that whole nighttime scouting mission, they all set the stage for this win, this crucial win. It really shows how he led, proactive.
Totally. But while he was celebrating this victory, Things weren't exactly smooth sailing for General George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac.
Ah, yeah, Little Mac. He was supposed to be leading the main Union Army to Richmond, the Confederate capital, but it seemed like he was constantly preparing, never actually getting there.
Yeah.
Our sources describe him as a brilliant organizer, but so incredibly cautious, always thinking the enemy was stronger than they really were.
Yeah, and it's almost funny when you hear about some of the tactics he used. Like, he actually used fake logs, painted to look like cannons to try and scare the enemy.
And get this, he actually thought the enemy was doing the same thing to him. It kind of makes you wonder, was he really that paranoid? Did he really think the enemy was that clever?
It really makes you think how much of his delay was him being cautious and how much was him just not wanting to take any risks.
Good question.
And all this time, while McClellan was stalling, a very different kind of Confederate general was making a name for himself in the Shenandoah Valley. Thomas Stonewall Jackson.
Ah, yes, Stonewall Jackson, the complete opposite of McClellan. Bold, decisive, willing to take risks. He often went up against larger Union armies with a much smaller force. He was known for his lightning-fast movements and surprise attacks, which, earned him the nickname Stonewall. He was a constant problem for the Union.
Yeah. His Valley campaign was a master class in what's called maneuver warfare. That's where you focus on outsmarting the enemy, using speed and surprise to get a strategic advantage, even when you're outnumbered.
Jackson was amazingly successful in the Valley. He tied down a large number of Union troops who could have been used elsewhere. It caused a lot of worry for Lincoln and his administration.
Our sources even mention some of his quirks, like how he believed that eating pepper caused pain in his left leg. Even brilliant military minds have their strange beliefs, I guess.
It's a good reminder that these historical figures were just regular people with their own personalities and quirks, which of course probably affected their decisions on the battlefield.
It's pretty wild to think that Lincoln had to deal with McClellan dragging his feet on one side and Jackson's unpredictable brilliance on the other. What a leadership challenge.
This is where Lincoln's strategic thinking really shines. He had to constantly assess the bigger picture, figuring out where to send resources, knowing every decision had big consequences.
So back to McClellan and his slow advance on Richmond. He finally started what's called the Peninsula Campaign, which involved moving his army by boat to the Virginia Peninsula and then marching toward the Confederate capital.
The Peninsula Campaign, on paper, was a bold plan, but McClellan's execution was, well, typical McClellan. Too cautious, always overestimating the enemy. He came up against Confederate General John Magruder at Yorktown, and even though he had way more men and firepower, McClellan just sat there for weeks.
Sounds like he was waiting for a trap. The sources say that Magruder, even though he was outnumbered, was really good at tricking the enemy, making it seem like he had a much larger force than he actually did.
And McClellan, always the cautious one, fell for it completely. He kept asking Lincoln for more troops, which just delayed things even more and drove Lincoln crazy.
It's frustrating to read about McClellan's delays, knowing that every day he waited meant more lives lost, the war dragging on and on.
Right. It's such a contrast to Lincoln's decisive action at Norfolk. Lincoln, with all the pressure of being president, was willing to trust his own judgment and take calculated risks. McClellan, with a huge army at his command, seemed paralyzed by indecision.
And eventually, even McClellan couldn't wait forever. He finally attacked Yorktown, but by that time, Magruder and his Confederate forces had already left.
A victory for McClellan, but kind of a pointless one. All those weeks spent preparing for a major siege, and in the end, there was no one to fight.
I can't imagine that did much for morale.
Right. The sources say even his own soldiers were starting to doubt him. They were tired of waiting around, and they didn't think he could actually win a decisive victory.
While McClellan was chasing after the retreating Confederates, Lincoln had another big decision to make. Stonewall Jackson was still causing chaos in the Shenandoah Valley, even threatening Washington, D.C. Lincoln had to choose: send reinforcements to McClellan for his push on Richmond, or send troops to stop Jackson.
This was a huge test for Lincoln. McClellan and his supporters were adamant that taking Richmond was the key to winning the war, and that he needed more troops.
But Lincoln, thinking strategically, knew that losing the capital, even for a short time, would be a disaster for Union morale and could even change the entire course of the war.
He made the tough call to focus on stopping Jackson, ordering General Irvin McDowell to take his troops to the Valley.
I can only imagine how McClellan reacted to that.
Oh, he was furious. He felt like Lincoln was sabotaging his campaign, taking away the resources he needed to win. But Lincoln was looking at the big picture. For him, it was about more than just taking Richmond. It was about saving the Union, preserving the idea of a united nation.
Meanwhile, back in Virginia, the Confederate forces, desperate to stop the Union advance on Richmond, clashed with McClellan's army at the Battle of Seven Pines. It was a brutal, chaotic fight with heavy losses on both sides.
The Battle of Seven Pines was a real turning point in the war, and for a few reasons. First, it resulted in the wounding of Confederate General Joseph Johnston, which meant Robert E. Lee had to take command.
And Lee, as we know, would become one of the most famous and successful generals in American history.
Exactly. Him coming onto the scene completely changed how the war played out.
It's also interesting that the Chickahominy River, which split the Union forces in two, played a big part in the confusion and chaos of the battle. It shows just how important geography and logistics are in war.
Absolutely. Even the most well-equipped army can be held back by bad communication, poor supply lines, and not understanding the terrain.
So Seven Pines ended in a bloody stalemate. But it also paved the way for Lee to enter the conflict, something that would have a huge impact on how the war would unfold. So Seven Pines ended in a bloody stalemate, but it also paved the way for Lee to enter the conflict, something that would have a huge impact on how the war would unfold.
Yeah, with Lee leading the Confederate forces now, everything was about to change. He was brilliant at strategy and knew just how to inspire his troops.
Right.
He was going to be a tough opponent for the Union in the years to come.
This 1 week is amazing.
It really is.
I mean, it's like a snapshot of the whole war. Great leadership, frustrating setbacks, these larger-than-life personalities clashing,
Yeah.
and that constant question,
Yeah.
be cautious or be bold.
What strikes me is how this week shows that everything in the war was connected. What happened in the Shenandoah Valley directly affected what happened in the campaign for Richmond, and the other way around.
Right.
Lincoln, as commander-in-chief, had to manage all these moving pieces,
Yeah.
making decisions that would have consequences across the entire war.
You can really see the burden of responsibility he carried, political pressures, military losses,
Yeah.
and the constant threat of losing the war and the nation falling apart.
And yet, even with all that, he never gave up on keeping the Union together. He was resilient, a strategic thinker, willing to make the hard choices.
Right, even when they weren't popular.
Exactly.
Looking back on this week, what do you think we can learn from it?
A few things, I think. First, it shows how important leadership is when things are tough. Lincoln's willingness to challenge the usual way of thinking, to see things for himself, to make bold decisions even when people disagreed with him, well, it was crucial for the Union winning in the end.
It also tells us that leadership isn't just about tactics and orders.
No.
It's about vision, strategy, and being able to inspire people to work together for a common cause.
And lastly, I think it reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles in books. It's made by real people with their own strengths and weaknesses and what drives them.
Yeah.
Understanding that human side of things, well, I can give us a much richer and more, accurate understanding of the past.
Diving into this week in Lincoln's life has been an incredible journey. I feel like I have a much better grasp on the challenges he faced and what made him such an amazing leader.
It really does make you think, what if McClellan had been more like Lincoln, decisive and action-oriented? Could they have ended the war sooner? Could so many lives have been saved?
Questions for the history books, for sure. But one thing's clear. Lincoln's leadership during this week and throughout the war was key to shaping America's history. His legacy still inspires us and challenges us today.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive.
We hope you found it interesting and something to think about. If you want more deep dives like this, exploring all sorts of fascinating topics, don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive. We'll keep you informed and entertained, all without overwhelming you with information.